The death certificate said Dorothy Williams died on June 15, 1960. But Margaret Thompson was born on June 16, 1960. Same woman, different life, different family, different world. For 6 decades, she managed to keep these two identities separate, until the day she died, and left behind evidence that revealed the most elaborate disappearance in modern history. Welcome to Still Human. Here we explore the extraordinary lengths people will go to for freedom, love, and a second chance at life. In this story, you'll witness how one woman's desperate decision to escape became a 60-year masterpiece of deception, sacrifice, and ultimately, love. This is about identity, family, and the question, can you ever truly leave your past behind? Before we dive into this incredible tale of 2 lives, tell us where you're watching from today. Which city? Which country? Share in the comments. We love connecting with our global community. And if you believe that everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because every day we share stories that prove it's never too late to start over. Detroit, Michigan, 1960. Dorothy Marie Williams was 25 years old and trapped in a life that was slowly killing her. On the surface, Dorothy had everything a woman in 1960 was supposed to want. A husband with a steady job at the Ford plant, a small house in a working-class neighborhood, and the promise of children someday. But behind closed doors, Dorothy's life was a nightmare. Her husband, Robert Williams, was an alcoholic with violent tendencies who saw his wife as property rather than a person. Dorothy had married him at 19, believing his promises to change, believing that love could overcome anything. 6 years later, she knew better. The abuse had started small: cruel words, controlling behavior, isolation from friends and family. But by 1960, Robert's violence had escalated to the point where Dorothy feared for her life on a daily basis. She had tried to leave twice, but Robert had found her both times and dragged her back home. "If you ever try to leave me again," Robert had told her after the second attempt, "I'll kill you, and then I'll kill your sister's kids, just to make sure you understand I'm serious." Dorothy believed him. Robert had already put her in the hospital 3 times with accidents that the doctors didn't quite believe but couldn't prove. In 1960, there were no domestic violence shelters, no restraining orders, no protection for women like Dorothy. The police considered domestic disputes private family matters. Dorothy was completely alone. But Dorothy Williams was also incredibly intelligent. She had graduated valedictorian from high school. Over the course of 6 months, Dorothy began planning something unprecedented. She was going to disappear completely. Not just leave town or change her name, but cease to exist as Dorothy Williams altogether. Dorothy had read about people who had successfully faked their own deaths, usually for insurance money or to escape debts. But Dorothy's plan was more ambitious and more carefully crafted than anything that had come before. She was going to die as Dorothy Williams and be reborn as someone entirely new. Dorothy's plan began with months of meticulous preparation. She started by slowly withdrawing small amounts of money from their joint bank account. Amounts too small for Robert to notice, but substantial enough to accumulate over time. She researched how death certificates were issued, how car accidents were investigated, and most importantly, how to obtain a new identity without raising suspicion. Dorothy's breakthrough came when she learned about Margaret Thompson, a woman who had died in infancy in 1935. Margaret's death had been recorded, but the child had lived so briefly that there were no other records, no school enrollment, no social security number, no documentation of a life lived. Dorothy realized she could become Margaret Thompson. The real Margaret would have been 25 in 1960, exactly Dorothy's age. The plan Dorothy devised was elegant in its simplicity. First, she would stage a car accident that would leave her body unrecoverable. Dorothy had researched bridge accidents and knew that bodies were often never found when cars went into deep water. Second, she would use the Margaret Thompson identity to start over in a different state, far from anyone who might recognize her. Third, she would never, ever contact anyone from her old life again. Not her sister, not her friends, not her former colleagues. Dorothy Williams would be completely dead to the world. The hardest part wasn't the logistics. It was saying goodbye to the people she loved without being able to tell them why. Dorothy's sister Helen was her closest friend and confidant. Helen knew about Robert's abuse, but didn't know how to help her sister escape. Dorothy wanted desperately to tell Helen the truth, but she knew that Helen would try to talk her out of it, and worse, that Helen might accidentally reveal the plan to someone else. So Dorothy began gradually distancing herself from Helen, creating small conflicts and cooled interactions, so that her sudden absence wouldn't seem completely shocking. "I don't understand what's happening to Dorothy," Helen confided to a neighbor. "She's been so distant lately, almost like she's angry with me about something." Dorothy hated herself for hurting Helen, but she knew it was necessary. If Helen grieved Dorothy's death, at least she would eventually heal. If Dorothy stayed and Robert eventually killed her, Helen would carry that guilt and trauma forever. On June, the Monroe Bridge spanned the Detroit River at its deepest point. Cars that went off the bridge were rarely recovered, and bodies could be swept out to Lake Erie and never found. On the evening of June 15, 1960, Dorothy Williams drove her 1957 Chevrolet to the bridge. She had told Robert she was going to the grocery store, a mundane lie, for an extraordinary night. Dorothy parked her car at the bridge's midpoint, where the guardrail had been damaged in a previous accident and temporarily repaired with wooden barriers. She removed her purse, her wedding ring, and her shoes, leaving them in the car, along with a note that read, "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry, Dorothy." But Dorothy wasn't in the car when it went into the river. Earlier that day, Dorothy had loosened the wooden barrier and positioned wooden blocks behind the rear wheels of her car. When she released the parking brake and removed the blocks, the car rolled forward, through the damaged guardrail and into the dark water below. Dorothy watched from the shadows as her old life sank beneath the surface. The search for Dorothy Williams lasted 2 weeks. Divers found the car, but no body, which wasn't unusual given the river's strong current and connection to Lake Erie. Robert Williams played the grieving widower perfectly, telling police that his wife had been troubled and depressed lately. "I should have seen the signs," Robert told detectives. "She'd been acting strange, distant. I thought it was just stress from her job, but I guess it was more serious than I realized." The death certificate was issued on June 30, 1960. Dorothy Marie Williams, age 25, died by suicide. Case closed. But 200 miles away, in Cleveland, Ohio, Margaret Thompson was renting a small apartment and looking for work as a secretary. Margaret Thompson's life began cautiously. Dorothy had given herself enough money to survive for several months while she established her new identity, but she needed to find work quickly. The Social Security Administration in 1960 was far less sophisticated than it would become in later decades. Margaret was able to obtain a Social Security number by presenting forged documents showing she had been born in Kentucky and raised by an aunt who had recently died. Margaret's first job was as a secretary at a small accounting firm in Cleveland. She was efficient, reliable, and friendly, but not overly social. She rented a modest apartment, attended a local church, and gradually built a quiet life for herself. The hardest part wasn't establishing the new identity. It was living with the weight of what she had done. Every day Margaret read the Detroit newspapers, looking for any mention of Dorothy Williams or her family. She learned that Robert had remarried within a year of her death, which both relieved and disgusted her. She read about Helen's wedding, about the births of Helen's children, about her own parents' deaths, events she could never acknowledge or participate in. Margaret Thompson had to watch Dorothy Williams' family live their lives without her, grieve for her, and eventually move on. It was the price of freedom, but it was higher than she had anticipated. In 1965, 5 years after Dorothy's death, Margaret met Thomas Thompson at a church social. Thomas was a kind, gentle man who worked as a high school math teacher. He was nothing like Robert Williams. Patient, respectful, supportive of Margaret's independence and intelligence. Margaret fell in love with Thomas, but loving him meant lying to him every day for the rest of her life. When Thomas proposed in 1966, Margaret accepted, but insisted on a small wedding with minimal documentation. She claimed her family was from Kentucky, but that she had no living relatives. Thomas, who had also lost his parents young, understood and didn't press for details. Margaret Thompson married Thomas Thompson on June 16, 1967, exactly 7 years after Dorothy Williams had died and Margaret had been born. Margaret and Thomas Thompson built a beautiful life together. Thomas never questioned Margaret's vague past or her reluctance to talk about her childhood. He simply loved the woman she was in the present. In 1968, Margaret gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Susan. 2 years later came Michael, and in 1973, their youngest, David. Margaret threw herself into motherhood with the passion of someone who had thought she would never have the chance to raise children. But every milestone in her children's lives was shadowed by the knowledge that half of their family history was a complete fabrication. When Susan asked about her maternal grandparents, Margaret would tell carefully crafted stories about fictional people. When the children needed medical history information, Margaret would invent genetic backgrounds. When they wanted to visit Mommy's hometown, Margaret would explain that it held too many sad memories. Margaret became an expert in deflection and misdirection, always steering conversations away from her past and toward the present and future. The closest Margaret ever came to being discovered was in 1985, when Susan decided to research the family genealogy for a high school project. Susan found records for Margaret Thompson's birth and early death in Kentucky, which didn't match her mother's stories. "Mom," Susan asked, "I have found some confusing records about your birth. Can you help me understand?" Margaret's heart stopped, but she managed to stay calm. "Oh, sweetheart, there were several Margaret Thompsons born around the same time in Kentucky. Record-keeping wasn't very good back then. You probably found someone else with the same name." Susan accepted the explanation, but Margaret realized how vulnerable her secret remained. She began creating more elaborate false documentation, always staying one step ahead of potential discovery. Meanwhile, in Detroit, the Williams family had long since moved on from Dorothy's death. Robert Williams had died in 1978, taking whatever suspicions he might have had to the grave. Helen Williams, now Helen Martinez, occasionally visited Dorothy's empty grave, but had built a full life of her own. Margaret followed her original family's lives through newspaper archives and eventually online searches, watching from a distance as nieces and nephews were born, graduated, married, and had children of their own. She was an aunt, a sister, a daughter to people who thought she was dead. The weight of carrying two complete life histories began to take its toll on Margaret in her later years. She developed what her family thought was early-stage dementia, but was actually the mental exhaustion of maintaining such an elaborate deception for decades. Thomas Thompson died in 2015 at the age of 78, leaving Margaret alone with her secret. His death hit her harder than she had expected, not just because she loved him, but because he was the only person in her Margaret Thompson life who had known her before she had children to protect. With Thomas gone, Margaret began to consider whether she should take her secret to the grave or find a way to reveal the truth to her children. Margaret spent her final years writing 2 sets of letters, One set to her children, explaining who she really was and why she had done what she did. And another set to her original family in Detroit, telling them that she was alive and apologizing for the pain her disappearance had caused. Margaret also prepared a detailed documentation of her deception, including photographs, documents, and a timeline of how she had created and maintained the Margaret Thompson identity for 60 years. But Margaret never sent the letters to Detroit. She couldn't bring herself to disrupt her original family's lives, especially knowing that most of them had built their understanding of their family history around her death. Margaret Thompson died peacefully in her sleep on March 10, 2020, at the age of 85. Her children found her letters 3 days later while cleaning out her belongings. The revelation destroyed everything Susan, Michael, and David thought they knew about their family. "How could she lie to us for our entire lives?" David asked his siblings. "Everything we thought we knew about Mom was fake." But Susan, the oldest, had a different perspective. Maybe everything we knew about Mom was real. Maybe Dorothy Williams was the fake identity, and Margaret Thompson was who she really wanted to be. The Thompson children faced an impossible decision. Should they honor their mother's original wish to remain dead to her first family, or should they reach out to the Williams family and reveal the truth? After months of debate, they decided to contact Helen Martinez, Dorothy's sister, who was still alive at age 88. The phone call was the most— "Mrs. Martinez," Susan said, "I think I might be your niece. My mother was Dorothy Williams." Helen's reaction was everything the Thompson children had feared: shock, anger, grief, and a profound sense of betrayal. "Do you know what your mother put us through?" Helen asked. "We mourned her for 60 years. We visited her grave. We told our children about their aunt who died young. And she was alive the whole time, but after the initial shock wore off, Helen began to understand the impossible situation Dorothy had faced in 1960. "I knew Robert was hurting her," Helen admitted. "I tried to help, but there weren't options for women back then. Maybe what she did was the only way she could survive." Today, the Thompson and Williams families are slowly building a relationship based on their shared love for a woman who was both Dorothy and Margaret. Helen has met her nieces and nephews for the first time, and the Thompson children have learned about their mother's real childhood and family history. Margaret's elaborate deception has been forgiven, if not fully understood. Her children realize that everything they loved about their mother was real: her kindness, her wisdom, her devotion to family. The only thing that was false was her name and her past. "She gave us a real family, built on a fake foundation," Michael Thompson said. "I don't know how to feel about that, but I know I can't be angry with her for wanting to live." Margaret Thompson's secret life lasted longer than most people's entire lifespans. She successfully maintained 2 complete identities for 60 years, raised 3 children who never suspected the truth, and created a loving family from nothing but determination and hope. Dorothy Williams died on June 15, 1960, but Margaret Thompson lived until March 10, 2020. In the end, they were both real, just different chapters of the same extraordinary woman's story. At Still Human, we believe that identity is more than just a name or a past. Sometimes the person we choose to become is more real than the person we were born to be. What would you sacrifice for a chance at a completely new life? How far would you go to protect the people you love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because every day we share stories that prove the human capacity for reinvention is limitless. See you in the next story.